Economic studies have actually taught us that investments in human development have the biggest rate of return if they occur early in life. So here you see the rate of return based on investments in human development, and every investment in human development, whether it's primary school education or preschool education, has a high rate of return on investment. But the earlier the investment, the bigger the return on investment. So we actually know that investing in early life is not only from a human perspective a very sensible investment that we can make, but also from an economic standpoint, we know that investing in early life is the cleverest investment that we can actually make. So there are actually three big arguments, I think, for investing in the early years. First of all, there's the scientific evidence, the biological, the medical, the psychological, and the pedagogical scientific evidence showing how incredibly important the early years are for later health and development. There are the economic arguments for investing in the early years. And then there is the social justice argument for investing in the first years of life, because in the Convention of Human Rights, there are fundamental rights for children that actually state that each and every child has the right to safety, to health, to food, and to stimulation. So if we want to lay the foundations for a healthier, more equal, and more just future, we need to invest in the early years of human beings. So when we look at what actually happens during that very critical early phase of life, we actually know that all the organs that we'll ever have are formed during those early years. And you cannot build your heart, your brain, your liver, your lungs once more. If you've built your heart, that's the heart that you'll have to live with for the rest of your life. We know that 80% of your brain development actually occurs during the first 1,000 days between conception and the second birthday. And it's incredibly important that that goes well, because the structure and function of the brain determines its lifelong function. So I already showed you in the animation that you grow incredibly rapidly, setting of thermostats like the stress axis, but also your immune system and food preferences are set very early in life. You attach to caregivers and learn whether the world is a safe place or not. You learn to eat and drink, so you develop food preferences, and you learn to recognize the sensation of being full or being hungry. We learn to communicate, and we learn something about cause and effect. And these are all very fundamental biological milestones that we need to reach within those first 1,000 days of life that actually have a long-term consequence. So if we look at what's needed for these biological milestones, it's really food, health, safety, love, and stimulation. And I just want to share with you a few slides to indicate what happens if there's a lack of food. I myself have done a lot of studies in the past 25 years investigating the long-term consequences of undernutrition during gestation. And we found that this has long-term impact, negative impact on later health. So if children do not have sufficient building blocks to actually build a body, it has long-term consequences in terms of increased rates of disease. And in the middle slide, you can see on the left-hand side, the brain of an adult who was prenatally well-nourished, and on the right-hand side, you see the brain scan of someone who was prenatally undernourished. And as you can see, brain size and structure was permanently altered, leaving lasting consequences in terms of increased rates of addiction, increased rates of psychiatric disease, and increased rates of Alzheimer's disease. But we also know that the provision of building blocks through the placenta is incredibly important. So air pollution actually diminishes the food transfer from the mother to the baby. So healthy and clean air is actually incredibly important in providing the building blocks for future generations. And as we know, obviously breastfeeding is a very important building block for building a healthy baby, for boosting its immune system, for reducing the risk of obesity. And if we look at health, really building a healthy heart and a healthy body is shaped by the environment, by a healthy mother and by the environment that's safe and healthy. And actually, we've just done studies where we've helped women before they became pregnant to improve their lifestyles. And we actually see that not only are these women more healthy during pregnancy and afterwards, but also their children's hearts are built better. So with one intervention, you can actually improve the health of 2 generations by making sure that parents start their journey as a parent in a healthy fashion. Obviously, safety is incredibly important, and we know a lot about the studies that have been done in the US in terms of adverse childhood experiences. So if safety cannot be guaranteed during the early years, this has long-term consequences, both for physical and mental health. And we know that the costs of adverse childhood experiences is incredibly high. Children who've experienced several adverse childhood experiences lose 20 years of life expectancy, and also incur a lot of societal costs. So this is something we need to prevent at all costs, really. Then if we look at love and stimulation, it's obviously very important for children to grow up in a loving and safe environment. And I'm sure you're all aware of the still face experiment that really causes distress if children can't connect to their parent or caregiver. And I'm actually really quite worried with studies showing that if you look at your smartphone, there is the situation of children being confronted with a still face from their parent, where the child doesn't get the connection it's actually looking for, but also the parent cannot pick up the signals that the child is actually sending out. And just as the brain is being wired during this critical period of development, it could create these paths that will be used more and more often in the brains of these children. So if they feel that they're being ignored often, this has lasting consequences for their sense of being safe and being heard and seen. If we look at stimulation, there's a lot we can do, and I just wanted to share one example with you showing that stimulation doesn't have to cost any money necessarily. So here are the results of a study that were done in the US 20 years ago, following children from birth to their 3rd birthday, counting the words that these children heard. And some children grow up in families where they hear few words, while other children grow up in families where they hear a lot of words. And at the age of 3, there's a 30 million word gap between children who've grown up in language-rich families compared to children who grow up in families where they heard fewer words. And this has actually consequences for the vocabulary of these 3-year-olds. Children who grew up in families where they heard a lot of words have twice as big a vocabulary compared to children who grew up in families with fewer words. And this has consequences for the ability of the toddler to actually explain to the parents what it means, to explain to a friend at school or daycare what he or she wants to do. And you can imagine that this is a skill multiplier effect that has a lot of consequences for chances in bonding, in friendship, in school for these children. So this is a really cheap but very important building block for the brains of future generations. And these building blocks for the brains of future generations are incredibly important, because if we build a better brain, it will boost mental and physical health, it will boost learning experience, it will improve chances on the labor market, and it will reduce relationship problems as well as criminal activities. So boosting child development is a very promising way to actually break the intergenerational cycle of poverty and abuse. And as you can see, children who grew up in families where they were able to actually build their brain will also in the future be better parents. So that actually will break the cycle. In the Convention of Human Rights, it's very clear that parents are the primary responsible adults for raising children, but at the same time, governments have the obligation to support and inform parents about their role as a parent, and have the obligation to support parents in the best possible way, or being the best possible parent they could be. And in a study in the Netherlands, we've investigated whether parents are aware of the fact that they're important and how they feel about parenthood. And what they told us generally is that they think that parenting is the most beautiful, but at the same time also the most challenging task that they have. And in that study, 91% of parents indicated that they found parenting actually quite a challenging thing. 50% of their parents indicated that they feel insecure and would like to do things differently, but 67% of parents actually indicated that they are afraid to ask for help. So this is a very important message, I think, in practical terms, that if parents don't have a question, if they do not reach out for help, it doesn't mean that they don't need help and don't want help. It's just something they do not ask for. And we actually know that this uncertainty and the unwillingness or inability to ask for help increases stress levels. And obviously we know that stress is part of life and can't always be prevented, but stress in parents can actually reduce their parenting skills. And scientific studies have actually shown that if we provide social support, that's a very important antidote to stress. We now know how that works epigenetically in the brain, but it's very important to know that even in stressful situations like crises, we know that providing social support is an important antidote to stress that can actually help prevent long-term negative consequences for childhood development occurring. So please know that providing social support to parents and young children is an incredibly important investment in a better childhood development. So I just explained to you the 5 elements that are needed in the early years: food, health, safety, love, and stimulation. And I'm convinced that as a parent, as a family member, as a volunteer, as a professional, as an employer, and as governments, and any other person, you can contribute to each and every single one of those 5 elements in your own way. And that contribution can actually make a difference in a child's life. I just wanted to name one example to show you what that could be. In the Netherlands, we have a system of maternity care where after the birth, a nurse comes to parents' homes to actually help them with caring for the baby. This is reimbursed by the insurance, but not every family uses all the maternity care that they are entitled to. And on the left-hand side, you see a city map of Amsterdam showing that there are big differences in the uptake of maternity care. And we know from our studies from Statistics Netherlands that families that actually use very little maternity care make more healthcare costs, both for the mother and for the child in the first year after birth. So this is one other example where one intervention actually has an impact on 2 generations if we would help these parents to actually use the maternity care and get themselves and their child off to a better start. I wanted to end my presentation by focusing a little bit on what we've learned from previous crises and pandemics about the importance of early childhood development. And this is research that was done into the 1918 flu pandemic, showing that men and women who were in utero during the pandemic actually had an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease. They had lower rates of graduation and lower rates of labor market participation, suggesting that the stress, the prenatal stress of going through a pandemic, not because the mother was infected, but just experiencing the pandemic itself, had lasting consequences both for schooling, for labor market participation, and for health. And again, we have evidence that social support could be the antidote to these stressful effects and could actually buffer some of these negative effects for the next generation. So I think the current crisis that we're in, or that we're coming out of, could actually also be seen as a period of transformation. And I think it's beautiful that the Chinese word for crisis actually has the word risk, but also the word of opportunity inside it. And I think that if we could use this crisis and transform into a society where we are not so much focused on treatment, but we're actually focused on prevention, where we're not reactive, but actually proactive, and where we're not focusing on providing medication and medical care once diseases have started, but if we actually saw society as a soil base provided to each and every individual human being to grow and develop to their full potential, we could actually build a much better, a much fairer, and a more just society. And that involves looking differently at parents. Parents aren't part-time workers. Parents are actually raising the future generation, and they do an important job. And we as governments and we as society need to support parents in doing that important job. And I think we need to look different at education, not as something that's compulsory, but actually is a fundamental right of children to develop to their full potential. And I think that if we would look at society in that way, we would not be focusing on more, but actually on winning in several areas if we allow every human being to develop to their full potential. So if we look at the Netherlands and we think about creating a climate in which every child gets a chance to develop to their full potential, it's incredibly insightful to look at where we spend our money. And almost most of our government money goes to medical care. And if we then look at the bottle of prescription pills, it has a very small sticker on it. That's the amount of money we actually invest in prevention. And I think that really shows why we're struggling with problems rather than actually preventing those problems from occurring in the first place. So what I think we can do and we should do is use this crisis as a process of transformation in which we try to give each child the best possible start in life and allow them to develop to their full potential, because we will all benefit. And for that, we mostly need a family-friendly society that actually contributes to all 5 of the basic elements that human beings need throughout the life course, but especially in the early years. We need clean air, we need a proper soil base. And I believe that if we do this together, so when I is replaced by we, even illness can become wellness. So as Leontine already explained in the book, I've tried to explain what each and every individual could do, from a parent to a professional, from a policymaker to government, in contributing to a good start in life. And I believe that if we share that information, if we inspire each other to contribute, we can actually multiply the impact. So that's what we've tried to do with the book launch, is give every ambassador 2 copies of the book and ask them to share their inspiration and thereby multiply the effect, just like you do when you throw a stone into the water. And I'd like to end my contribution with a quote from Desmond Tutu, who said, "Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits put together that will overwhelm the world." And I'd really like to end with quoting 2 Nobel laureates One is James Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, showing that everyone gains when we invest, develop, and sustain the early development of the world's greatest natural resource, its people. And Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize with his microcredit works in the Grameen Bank, who compared poor people like bonsai people. He stated that there's nothing wrong with the seed you planted, but society never provided the soil base for these people to grow and develop to their full potential. And I'd like to end my talk with a quote from Frederick Douglass, who said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men and women." Thank you very much for your attention.